Prince Andrew is living like a man who has already lost everything, and is now calculating exactly how much damage he can do on his way out. 10 months after being removed from Royal Lodge, the Duke of York has retreated to Marsh Farm on the Sandringham Estate in Norfolk, a life stripped of ceremony, of purpose, of the royal machinery that once defined him. He is 66 years old, largely invisible, and by most accounts absolutely furious about it. The public have moved on. The palace has moved on. King Charles has very deliberately moved on. Andrew has not. And now the first cracks in that enforced silence are starting to show in the most revealing possible ways. Earlier this month, photographs of Andrew travelling by car showed a large purple bruise across his cheek. Sources attributed it to a minor medical condition and said nothing further. No details, no clarity. Just a bruise on the face of a man the palace would rather the world forgot, circulating in the press whether they liked it or not. Then came the staff tirade. Reports emerged that Andrew had launched into a rage at members of his household, demanding to be addressed as the Duke, and threatening, and this is not a detail one invents, that failure to comply would result in a vampire appearing to suck every drop of blood from his royal veins. It would be funny if it weren't such a precise portrait of a man unravelling in real time. The grandiosity, the absurdity, the desperate insistence on deference, from the only people still obligated to show it to him. This is what exile has produced. Not humility, not reflection. A man at Marsh Farm, bruised and seething, conducting himself like a sovereign in a kingdom of staff who can't afford to quit. But the bruised cheek and the feudal tantrum are not the most dangerous thing Andrew carried with him to Marsh Farm, because buried beneath the wounded pride is something far more explosive. The money. It always comes back to the money. Andrew is not, by any conventional measure, a poor man. He lives at Marsh Farm at Charles's expense. His security detail, the one the Metropolitan Police withdrew in 2022, forcing the palace to fund a private alternative, costs an estimated £3 million a year. Charles has been absorbing that figure quietly, largely to prevent the alternative. An unprotected Andrew wandering into public life and attracting exactly the kind of attention the palace has spent years trying to suppress. It is, in every meaningful sense, payment for silence dressed up as fraternal generosity. Andrew has apparently decided it is not enough. According to sources close to the situation, Andrew has presented what amounts to a financial ultimatum. Not a request, not a negotiation, but a structured set of demands that reveals just how comprehensively he has convinced himself the family owes him a restoration. He wants ongoing financial support for Sarah Ferguson, whose breast cancer diagnosis in 2023 he has purportedly wielded as moral leverage, arguing that her medical costs and continued housing security are a crown obligation. He wants guarantees for Beatrice and Eugenie, not the modest provisions already in place, but something closer to the working royal infrastructure both women stepped away from. And for himself, he wants an arrangement that reflects, in his own framing, the dignity appropriate to a son of the late Queen. That phrase, dignity appropriate to a son of the late Queen, is doing enormous work. It is simultaneously a grievance and a threat. A reminder of lineage deployed as a financial instrument. Andrew is telling Charles in effect that his mother's legacy should be his meal ticket, that proximity to Elizabeth II should carry a price tag. What makes this remarkable is not the audacity, though the audacity is considerable. It is the timing. Charles is already funding a man who publicly humiliated the institution, who was stripped of his military titles and royal patronages, and whose association with Jeffrey Epstein remains an open wound in the monarchy's reputation. The king has been paying to contain that wound. Andrew is now demanding payment to keep it from reopening. That is the leverage, not sentiment, not family loyalty. The implicit threat embedded in every line of the demand is the same. Refuse me and watch what I do with what I know. And yet the demands themselves are only half the story, because what Andrew is reportedly prepared to do if those demands are refused is the moment this conflict stops being a family dispute and starts being something the palace cannot contain. People close to the situation have been careful with their language. They do not use the word blackmail. They speak instead of Andrew's position, his leverage, his perspective on what he is owed, but strip away the euphemisms and what remains is this: a senior royal figure, already discredited, already financially dependent on the crown, is threatening to speak. And what he is threatening to speak about is not his own story, it is everyone else's. The claim, according to sources who have spoken to royal correspondents over the past several months, is that Andrew spent decades at the absolute centre of royal life. He was there for conversations questions that were never meant to leave the room. He attended meetings, private dinners, family councils where the institution's most sensitive internal tensions played out without the filter of press secretaries or protocol. He knows things about Charles, about the machinery of succession, about decisions made quietly and deniably during the final years of Elizabeth II's reign, about the distance, deliberate and managed, that was placed between him and the rest of the family when Epstein first became a liability. He did not miss any of it, and he has not forgotten any of it. That is the nuclear option, not a tell-all book. Any publisher would have legal exposure, and Andrew's credibility is already shredded in the public mind. The real threat is more targeted: a single well-placed interview, a conversation with the right journalist in the right jurisdiction, a solicitor's letter raising questions that force palace lawyers to respond publicly. You do not need to be believed by everyone. You only need to be believed enough to force a reaction, and forcing a reaction from Buckingham Palace in the current climate, when the institution is already navigating Charles's cancer diagnosis, the ongoing rehabilitation of the monarchy's image post-Meghan, and the careful management of William's transition toward the throne, would be catastrophic. Palace aides by several accounts are not dismissing this. That itself is telling. These are experienced institutional operators who have weathered genuine crises. The Diana years, the abdication reverberations, the Epstein scandal itself, they are not easily rattled, and yet the internal calculation being made right now is not whether Andrew is bluffing. It is whether the cost of calling the bluff is survivable. The answer, apparently, is not obviously yes. What makes this so corrosive is that Andrew almost certainly knows the calculation being made. He has watched this institution manage risk for his entire adult life. He understands that it does not act on principle, it acts on consequence, and he has positioned himself as a consequence, not a brother, not a son, not a disgraced former naval officer asking for charity, a risk to be priced and managed. The outrage inside the palace is real. Staff who have served the family for years find his conduct by any measurable standard beyond justification, but outrage does not change the arithmetic. But while the palace debates whether to pay the price of Andrew's silence, Andrew himself has already begun moving pieces on the board, and his daughters have been placed directly in the middle. Beatrice and Eugenie did not ask for any of this. That point matters, and it tends to get buried. In the days before Peter Phillips' wedding, Andrew was on the phone to both daughters. The message he delivered was not subtle. Hold your heads high, walk in with confidence. Do not shrink. Fight for your place in this family. Those were not the words of a father offering comfort. They were the words of a general issuing orders before a deployment. The venue was a wedding. The objective was visibility. The daughters were the mechanism. People close to the situation described it as coaching. That is probably the generous interpretation. What Andrew understood with the cold clarity of someone who has spent decades watching how royal optics function is that his daughters carry legitimacy he no longer personally commands. When Beatrice and Eugenie appear at a family event, composed, present, their heads held precisely as instructed, they do not read as extensions of a disgraced father. They read as York women, princesses. Continuity, and continuity in this family is the closest thing to absolution. So he used them, not cruelly perhaps, not without love, but the line between paternal guidance and strategic deployment had already been crossed before either of them walked through that door. What makes this genuinely painful is that Beatrice and Eugenie are not passive figures. Both have worked to construct identities separate from the wreckage their father has created. Beatrice, quietly, has done more than most to rehabilitate the York name through sheer consistency of conduct. Eugenie's advocacy work has been real and sustained. They have spent years carefully building distance from the Epstein fallout without ever publicly betraying their father, a balancing act that requires extraordinary discipline and extracts an invisible toll. And now that careful distance is being collapsed by him, because he needs warm bodies in a room to signal that the family has not fully excised him. The cruelty is structural rather than intentional. Andrew almost certainly believes he is protecting them by teaching them to fight. He may even believe that his survival is their survival, that if he goes quietly they lose something too. There is probably some truth in that. But there is a difference between a father shielding his children and a father advancing his own position using his children as cover, and Andrew has decisively crossed from one into the other. And that is precisely what makes Charles's position so treacherous, because whatever he decides, the consequences will not fall on Andrew alone. Charles is not a man who enjoys being cornered. His entire reign has been constructed around the idea of a modernized, leaner, more purposeful monarchy, one that earns its place rather than simply inheriting it, and yet here he he sits, facing a dilemma that no amount of institutional reform can dissolve, because it is not a policy problem, it is a family problem wearing the clothes of a constitutional crisis. The calculus is brutal in its simplicity. If Charles yields, if Andrew is permitted to remain at Royal Lodge, if his allowance is quietly restored, if the soft rehabilitation continues, then the palace has effectively confirmed that leverage works, that a disgraced prince with enough secrets and enough shamelessness can simply wait out his own consequences. Every future royal with a grievance will have noted the precedent. The monarchy's willingness to enforce its own rules will have been exposed as conditional, available for negotiation to anyone willing to threaten loudly enough. But refusing carries its own catastrophic risk. Andrew has spent decades inside this institution. He attended briefings, sat in rooms, heard conversations that were never meant for public consumption. Whether his actual knowledge constitutes a genuine threat or merely an implied one almost does not matter at this point, because the threat itself is already doing its work. The fear of what he might say is functionally identical to the damage of him saying it. Charles cannot call the bluff without risking that it isn't one, and so the palace has been doing what institutions do when they cannot find a clean exit. It has been managing, delaying, containing, hoping that Andrew will run out of money before Charles runs out of patience, hoping the story fades before it detonates, hoping the daughters hold. None of these are strategies, they are the absence of one, dressed in the language of careful deliberation. Meanwhile, Andrew stays in the lodge, the lawyers communicate, the daughters attend what they must attend, and the institution that has survived abdications and divorces and scandals that would have destroyed lesser organizations continues to absorb the damage in silence, which leaves the one question no one inside the palace has yet found the courage to answer out loud. What this standoff reveals, stripped of all the procedural language and palace discretion, is something the institution would prefer you never quite articulate. The modern monarchy is only as strong as the silence of the people it has failed. That is the structural vulnerability, not republicanism, not tabloids, not even the Sussex defection, which for all its noise changed very little. The real exposure comes from within, from those who were given proximity and prestige and then watched both get taken away. Andrew was never a peripheral figure. He was a son, a duke, a man who sat in rooms where decisions were made, and whatever he carries from those rooms, real or rumoured, is now the invisible weight on every negotiation about a gate lodge in Windsor. The palace has survived because it controls the story. What it cannot survive, at least not cleanly, is someone who knows which parts of the story were never told. Whether Andrew has genuinely made that calculation, whether there is a file, a conversation, a name he has never said publicly but has made clear he could, nobody outside a very small circle knows. And that uncertainty is precisely the point. It doesn't need to be true to be effective. It only needs to be believable. He is still in the lodge. That should tell you everything. If you want to keep going deeper on the stories the palace would rather you stopped asking about, subscribe to Regal Desk. We will keep asking.